from the Sporting News, Vinnie Iyer. Vinnie, how you doing today?
Good. How's it going, guys?
Doing pretty good. So let's first go over the game last night to start of week 2, and then we'll get into some other these teams. I have to say, I came away was pretty impressed. You know, the Texans, they are without their second best defensive player, 2 of their 4 best offensive weapons, and they still found a way to win last night. I mean, talk about a team win.
Yeah, it was a strange battle of attrition that we saw. All it took really was who was going to make the big game-changing play, and it became Deshaun Watson off a kind of a busted third down play that just found Green all in front of him. Really, the game was really set up by that John Ross fumble early to help that. So it was the team that made the most mental mistakes in a close game that lost, and Cincinnati by far made those. And now they're 0-2, haven't scored a touchdown after 2 home games. It's a pretty disastrous start there.
Yeah, Cincinnati, I heard last night, is the first team since the 1939 Eagles to not score a touchdown in NFL history in their first 2 games. I mean, talk about the regression of Dalton. I mean, it seems to be more and more that when Jay Gruden and Hugh Jackson were the offensive coordinators, you know, he was a solid quarterback, but without them, he's just really regressed.
Well, I wrote about it a little bit in the Sporting News. Since that thumb injury that kind of put him out in 2015 at the end, he was having his best season. They flipped A.J. McCarron. They lost that hard playoff game to the Steelers. Things have just not been good for Andy Dalton since. And this is where I separate the truly elite quarterbacks versus the kind of the middle of the road, maybe above average at Dalton at his best. Just guys that really need everything in place. They need the offensive line to be right. The protection has to be good. The running game has to help them out. They need a good progression of receivers from number 1 to slot to tight end. And Andy Dalton used to have all those things. Now he doesn't really have much of those things. He have A.J. Green and Tyler Eifert, but not much else going on right now to help Andy Dalton. And Ken Zampese's play calling also hasn't helped either. He's just not as good as Jay Gruden or Hugh Jackson. So all those things have added up to what we've seen with Andy Dalton. That said, even with that line play and all that stuff, he was missing a lot of basic throws and very inaccurate with throws that every NFL quarterback should make.
Vinny, I gave this theory yesterday on the air, and I want to run it by you, and that is I think that we're seeing more and more poor offensive line play around the league. We saw some of it last night between the Bengals and the Texans. You know, the Seahawks for the last few years have had atrocious offensive lines. Eli Manning, he doesn't even have 2 seconds to think. You know, he's getting arguably planted on his rear end during that Cowboys game last week. I'm looking at a guy like Deshaun Watson, the guys like Marcus Mariota, Jameis Winston, Carson Wentz, Derek Carr. These are guys who they want to throw the ball, but because they have the mobility and the elusiveness and the athleticism, they can get away from a rush much better than, let's say, a Phillip Rivers can. And to me, I think that's where the league has to go, because the offensive linemen coming out of college, they are just not prepared to play in the NFL. So you're going to need a quarterback who can do a little bit of running.
Well, I think the key here is, if you've seen in recent years the wide receiver type picks or the running back luxury picks as maybe a committee back, those have kind of been wasted picks versus these teams like the Cowboys and the Titans and just piling up on offensive linemen. The Raiders did it a different way. They went out in free agency, realized the importance of that, really stocked up on difference makers up front. So all these teams that have recognized that, invested in that, used the draft picks for that, you see the things paying off. And then you have a team like the Patriots or the Packers that have found particular guys with their scouting acumen, like David Bakhtiari and Marcus Cannon, players like that have held up pretty well. So it's all these teams that know and respect and make that a priority, and it's paying off for those teams.
Talking with Vinnie Iyer of the Sporting News here on 97.3 ESPN. Vinnie, looking ahead to week 2, we know that some of these teams, I know fans, they overreact. People say my team's 1-0, we're going to win the Super Bowl. Team says they're 0-1, we're the worst team in history. But one of those teams that is 0-1 that I think that we can definitely take a step back with, just because the Patriots and the Seahawks are 0-1 doesn't still make them two of the top tier teams. And I think we could possibly see the Patriots and the Seahawks have really big games this weekend.
Yeah, you look at those two teams, extremely tough matchups to start right away. The Chiefs came into New England, but still a very tough team, and then definitely Green Bay going up there is very difficult for Seattle. So now you can reboot here. You feel pretty good, definitely if you're a Seattle fan, because you get San Francisco at home. A pretty good get-well game for your offense and defense. And then you look at New England. This is a little bit concerning because of the way their defense played the last week, that it might be shootout city. Their defense has to play much better against Drew Brees and all his weapons this week. The Patriots, there's a lot of pressure on Tom Brady now. We saw that, he might have one of his best seasons ever, if not mirroring something we saw in 2007. But now it might be a necessity with the way that defense was kind of lost. Now Dante Hightower, the kind of the glue, the versatile guy that can play linebacker, defensive end as needed, is probably going to be out here for a little while. So it's going to be more and more on Tom Brady, especially with no Danny Woodhead here in the short term. Danny Amendola in the short term. So when you look at all that, Brady's got to come through with that epic season if the Patriots are going to get where they want to be.
And you could argue a guy like Tom Brady, he is more equipped to deal with not having his best player available than other guys because he's done it so many times. We forget that this is a guy who won the Super Bowl with guys like Givens and Branch and Ben Watson. He didn't always have elite skill guys at those wide receiver and tight end positions. So when he does lose a Gronk, when he does lose an Edelman, he is able to find ways to still run that offense without them.
Definitely. And you look at how this game shapes up. You look at the receivers that New England has when you go down the line with Brandon Cooks, Chris Hogan, and Rob Gronkowski. They're pretty much better versions of what the Vikings had with Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, and Kyle Rudolph. So you figure they're going to have a lot of success with those three players in particular leading their passing game here in New Orleans. So New Orleans, we thought their defense was improved for about 5 minutes, and then everything came unraveling there. So I think the Patriots are going to rebound big time and put up maybe 40-plus points this week.
Vinny, going into our backyard here in the NFC East, the Eagles with a big win in Washington in Week 1. They got to go to Kansas City Week 2, a bit of a mentor versus protege type of deal with Andy Reid and Doug Peterson. Also Andy Reid, the former coach of the Eagles. So a lot of different variables going into this game. But focusing just on the Eagles, I know it's just one game, but from what Carson Wentz did in that Redskins game, you could argue without him they would not have won the game because of how many times he escaped sacks and still made plays. What is your perspective on Carson Wentz from year 1 to year 2 at this point?
Yeah, it must be mirror image Sunday with the Bills-Panthers and that game, and then you have the Redskins-Rams. So just a lot of teams that know each other pretty well from the personnel. But you look at with Carson Wentz, the key is just having a normal progression of receivers. We know the offensive line was going to get better with Lane Johnson, and then you have just a steady diet there of guys. Alshon Jeffrey's your number one. Nelson Aguilar is comfortable in the slot. You have Torrey Smith as your deep threat, and Zach Ertz at tight end. So when you have all that there, when you put all those things in place, that's how you kind of have a checklist of, are these things all going to help the young quarterback, and everything is in place for Carson Wentz for sure. So it'll be interesting. I think you'll see Wentz and Alex Smith almost have the similar type games. I think there are a lot of comparisons between Wentz and Smith. I think Carson Wentz has probably got a lot of due praise for his arm, where Alex Smith, we just forget that he can throw when Andy Reid calls upon him. So I think it's going to be a pretty close game of two very similar teams.
You look at the Chiefs without Eric Berry. It's interesting because you go back to the 2 years that he missed, one with the injury, one because he was dealing with cancer, and that is those years, their secondary, their pass defense was actually still top 10 in the league, but it was their run defense that suffered a little bit, which is very interesting to me. And now they bring in a guy like Benny Logan. How do you think the Chiefs are going to play this year without Eric Berry?
Yeah, another crossover there. Benny Logan, Eagles, Chiefs kind of match up there. I think the one thing, they don't have to worry about that too much in this game. That's the one thing that's going to be troublesome for Wentz. I mentioned all those other elements, but the running game, they got to find someone there to consistently run the ball and get those yards that are available. So I think that's a break this week. It's not always going to be the case, but the Eagles are a good matchup in that sense. And that's why I have the Chiefs winning the game, because I think they'll be able to run a little bit better with Kareem Hunt than the Eagles and their committee.
Talk with Vinnie Iyer of the Sporting News here on 97.3 ESPN. You can follow Vinnie on Twitter at Vinnie Iyer. Vinnie, staying in the NFC East, you look at the Giants, they lost week one. The Cowboys won week one, but both of them have very different matchups this week. And I'm looking at this as a situation where the Cowboys could lose in Denver and the Giants could win at home, and both of them could be sitting at 1-1, and it kind of just evens everything out at that point. You could basically have you could have basically the entire division walking in the next week being 1-1.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would look at in this Cowboys-Broncos game, I think the Broncos might be a weaker version of the Giants in terms of defense right now, because I think you can run on the Broncos. You can also work those underneath routes. I don't think their linebackers are very good in coverage. So Dak Prescott's typical game now is Des Bryant's covered by a top corner, which he's going to see in Aqib Talib. He can just work the slot in the middle of the field. I think the one challenge is going to be Chris Harris Jr. in the slot. They have to look for him so he doesn't make those mistakes. So this is a very tough matchup for Denver on this short week. I think Dallas is probably going to approach the game very similarly, but I think they should expect already to run and have that intermediate success in this game.
What is your ultimate over or under reaction from week one that you've heard and seen that just is driving you nuts? Like for me, the one overreaction I've heard the most that's driving me nuts is, for example, that the Seahawks lost in Green Bay. That means they're going to have a losing season. I just keep thinking it's one game. Like they played Aaron Rodgers, for goodness sake. They're not going to play Aaron Rodgers every week.
Yeah, I mean, they still held down the Green Bay offense pretty well in that game. So let's keep that in mind. And one thing that I think people need to stow away from that game is Russell Wilson. He did run. He looked more like his old self. And people were always on the Seahawks offensive line. I mentioned the elite quarterbacks and overcome that. We know Drew Brees can overcome some of his things that we've had, and Aaron Rodgers can too as well with the injuries there. I think with Russell Wilson, if he's healthy, he kind of negates those offensive line problems because he can buy so much time. He's mobile. He can make things happen when he's flushed out of the pocket. So that's the one thing I would be very happy with. Now, it's not thrilling that he was your leading rusher if you're a Seattle fan, but the good news is it looks like Thomas Rawls is coming back this week as well. So I think Rawls is probably their best overall runner, and I think they need to get C.J. Prosise more involved. But I think this offense can get going here in a real hurry.
Vinny, one more question before I let you go, and I always appreciate the time here on 97.3 ESPN. You look at this situation, we mentioned earlier the Saints, but the team they played, the Vikings, Sam Bradford looked very good. He finally has an offensive line to block for him. They're going to Pittsburgh this week. I don't know if they're going to win that game, but I do think that the Vikings, what they showed versus the Saints last week is that this is a much improved team offensively, and it's finally an offense that at least skill-wise and ability-wise can keep up with the defense.
Yeah, the one thing I always say when you play the Saints, it's almost like a bingo free space for your offense. You don't really learn too much about an offense, even if they're talented as the Vikings. I mean, I just mentioned that they have all those things now, and Dalvin Cook out of the backfield. So there's some legitimate weapons there. The remixed offensive line worked for one game. It'll be a good test this week because the Steelers can get after the quarterback. They can stop the run. Pretty good front seven. So we'll see how good that offensive line is this week. And if Sam Bradford, if he's pushed into a shootout with Ben Roethlisberger, how well he performs in that. So I still have to see more from this Vikings offense. I really like the dimension that Cook brings, but I think you have to look at 4 games to really get a good read on all these teams. And this is good because it's a nice balance on the road, short week with the Steelers where you can kind of play off what you saw in week 1.
He is Vinnie Iyer. You can follow him on Twitter at Vinnie Iyer. The Sporting News. Vinny, always appreciate the time. Football is finally here, and we actually got real games to chew on each week, so it's a good time.
All right, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.